Welcome everyone to this online webinar. I'm very honored as a Vice Rector of Diversity Policy to welcome Professor Emeritus Dr. Gloria Wekker. The more than 900 registrations for this evening illustrate that decolonization is an important and living theme that resonates with both the society and the core of our university. A theme that touches many areas, such as education and international policy, but the research field, for example, is also being challenged. From the perspective of diversity policy, it is important to accept and take up this challenge. During this policy period, we have focused on three central objectives. First, we have the ambition to become an inclusive university with a human and committed side. Our action plan strives for the well-being, community building, participation and involvement of everyone. We communicated this ambition more explicitly during this academic year. Secondly, it is also our ambition to realize an inclusive education and work culture by making students and staff aware of their position and frameworks and equipping them with skills that encourage the broadening of their frames of reference. In this matter, decolonization is a more than relevant theme. Where are our sources of knowledge and with whom and how do we collaborate? And then finally, in recent months, we focused strongly on being able to draw a clear line with regard to unacceptable behavior and discrimination, a line we will not cross. But we are definitely not there yet, and the work needs continuous attention as it is never finished. We have a tradition of building our policies on data, and we must find ways to collect them in a targeted manner, within the limits of the legislation, of course, and to develop appropriate actions. Our long traditions on gender and disability policy are good examples from which we can learn for other policy domains. For example, we are now starting a working group LGBTQI+, to broaden the gender perspective and are collaborating with the HR department for recruiting staff members with a migration background. But we cannot see these initiatives and different backgrounds as separate from each other and not independently from the social context and prevailing norms and power relations within it. On the contrary, at KU Leuven, we want to recognize a person as a unique collection of characteristics and competences, including all these perspectives, and help develop all these talents, because that's precisely the added value and the power. That's precisely where the added value and the power of diversity lie. And who is better to advise us on this than our central guest tonight, Emeritus Professor Dr. Gloria Wekker. Her report on the University of Amsterdam can only inspire us. Practice tested again the theoretical frameworks of decolonization and intersectionality. As a chair of the former diversity committee of the University of Amsterdam, she has had many conversations and knows better than anyone else which steps have or have not been taken. Her knowledge and insight gives us the opportunity to learn from. And we want to demonstrate that eagerness to learn tonight. I will listen very carefully, as you all will do, I suppose. But before we get to that, I would like to give the floor to Professor Nadia Fadil, who took up the engagement for this initiative together with the Diversity Policy Office. Nadia, I give the floor to you.
Thank you. Thank you. Good evening, everyone. Dear Vice Rector, dear colleagues and students, ladies and gentlemen. It is indeed my pleasure to moderate tonight this unique event on university and decoloniality. So my name is Nadia Fadil and I work as an associate professor in anthropology at the Faculty of Social Sciences. It is also my pleasure to see you quite numerous at tonight's event, which also shows the high level of interest this topic raises amongst many of you. The call to decolonize the university has indeed been one of the important movements in the recent decade. While this question is certainly not new, it has reached a new global momentum with the Rhodes Must Fall mobilization in South Africa, which saw the mobilization of students at the University of Cape Town in 2015 around the removal of the statue of Cecil Rhodes, a key British colonial administrator in South Africa and what is currently Zimbabwe. This movement trickled down to several university campuses worldwide. Less than 1 year ago, in June 2020, our own alma mater, the KU Leuven, decided to remove the bust of King Leopold II, Belgian monarch known for one of the most brutal colonial regimes, which led to the death of millions of Congolese. Commenting on this decision, our current rector, Luc Sels, argued that while Leopold II might be an important historical figure for our country, it is not the type of personality we as KU Leuven community want to honor with a statue. The message couldn't be clear. But the call to decolonize the university does not sit in isolation, nor is it restricted to certain symbolic measures, but it is often articulated together with other global movements, like the Black Lives Matter movement, and which saw the unprecedented mobilization of people inside and outside the university around issues of decolonization, racism, gender, sexuality, ableism, and redistribution. The core message of all these movements is clear. The universities, as they are organized today, do not serve the interest of humanity in all its diversity, nor our planet, but they often work for the profit and benefit of an extracting few, whether it's global industries within agriculture, the pharma industry, or the new technologies of surveillance, the nation states, through the sustainers of borders and frontiers, the maintenance of hierarchies according to gender, race, and culture, or the cultivation of worldviews that are human-centered and where the natural world only appears as a source of extraction or experimentation. All of this, the argument continues, is however only possible because of the type of knowledge or epistemology that is being produced at the university. While the university aims to be an open space of critical thinking and academic freedom, it is too often the facilitator of a one-sided perspective on the world. The knowledge that is produced too often draws upon and relies on modernist, Western, man-centered conceptions of the world, which relegate non-Western and non-human lives to the margins, and thus often glorify colonial perspectives on the world, often epitomized through the ideas like development, innovation, quality control, objectivity, scientificity, and so on. Many thinkers today have increasingly raised awareness on how the university produces what Buenaventura de Sousa Santos describes as a cognitive injustice. Social justice, he argues, is not possible without this epistemic justice, without recognizing the different epistemological traditions that exist in our world and thus also inform our outlook on the world. Decolonizing the university is therefore not a mere intellectual enterprise or exercise for that matter. It is fundamentally a call for social justice and democratization. In order to act upon the world, one first needs to understand it. And the way we understand it, the frameworks and instruments we use in this regard can either add more depth and richness to it, or at the contrary, amputate and silence perspectives, thus allowing only that which one is willing to see and hear to emerge. The fact that what type of knowledge can exist within the universities is a deeply political matter is visible today with full force in Europe. We are today the sad witnesses of how in our neighboring country, France, not to cite it, political authorities are waging a cultural war on intersectionality, decoloniality, and critical race studies at universities, as they are deemed contrary to the values of the Republic. This has led to the persecution and even death threats targeting different colleagues who currently work and live in very severe climate of anxiety and fear. I want to express my solidarity with them. And before, we also saw how the EU member state, Hungary, also not to cite it, firstly banned gender studies to then force the Central European University out of its country altogether, which is now operating from Vienna. The threat of academic freedom is therefore not only something that exists in faraway countries, but becomes very tangible from the very moment knowledge comes to effectively challenge a status quo. It is therefore my great pleasure and honor to welcome and introduce our central guest for tonight. I don't think we could have dreamed of a better person to tackle this topic on university and decoloniality tonight. Professor Emerita Dr. Gloria Wekker is a social and cultural anthropologist specializing in gender studies, sexuality studies, African American studies, and Caribbean studies. She has held several appointments, notably also at the University of Utrecht and the UCLA, and has published in a large number of areas, including the sexual subjectivity of women in the Black diaspora, knowledge systems in Dutch academia, and in the Dutch multicultural society, diversity in the arts, and on the history of Black migrants and refugees women's movement in the Netherlands. Her book, Kaleidoscopische Visies, de zwarte migranten en vluchtelingen vrouwenbeweging in Nederland, co-authored with Maaike Botman and Nancy Jouwe, and published in 2001, has been one of the classics for international feminist movements in the Netherlands and Flanders. And this is actually one of the first ways I got to encounter the work of Gloria Wekker, which really deeply inspired my own trajectory, both as an academic and also as a feminist. The organization in which I was active at the time, Steun met allochtone meisjes en vrouwen, LAVZW, was deeply inspired by the intersectional approach that you offered as a methodology and really was foundational for the creation of that organization. Professor Wekker is also the author of The Politics of Passion, Women's Sexual Culture in Afro-Surinamese Diaspora, published with Columbia University Press in 2006, and which obtained the Ruth Benedict's Prize from the American Anthropological Association. But most of you will probably know her from her book, White Innocence, Paradoxes of Colonialism and Race, published with Duke University Press in 2016, and published later in Dutch as Witte Onschuld, Paradoxen van Kolonialisme en Ras in 2017. In it, Professor Wekker explores this paradoxical attitude of ostensible denial, yet passionate refusal and thus attachment that characterizes Dutch attitude to race and its colonial past. She centrally unpacks how this mechanism of innocence also enables a continuous evasiveness and depoliticization of these crucial debates. Her book had a major influence in the Netherlands and Belgium and has been instrumental in accompanying larger discussions on racism in the Netherlands, but also in Belgium. In 2016, Professor Wekker was commissioned to conduct a study on the diversity at the University of Amsterdam. This study was published as a report, Let's Do Diversity, and has also had an important impact on the debate on the diversity or lack of diversity in the elite universities of the Netherlands, the UvA being one of them. I'm therefore very happy that she agreed to share her experience from that report and what we at KU Leuven might learn from it. After Professor Wekker's talk, Professor Steven Eggermont, Dean of the Faculty of Social Sciences, will give some comments. Professor Eggermont is a communication scientist and worldwide renowned expert on the effects of media exposure on perceptions and behavior of children and youth in particular. But tonight he will respond from his position as Dean of the Faculty of Social Sciences and Chair of the University Broad projectgroep Charter Inclusieve Universiteit that aims to develop a roadmap for a more inclusive university at KU Leuven. This initiative was launched in September 2020, following the tragic death of our student Nadia and the shocking revelations around the circumstances of his death. It aims to foster a safe and respectful, inclusive environment at KU Leuven for staff and students. We are very happy Steve, that you accepted this invitation to act as respondents to Professor Wekker's lecture. Your drive and commitment to do something about diversity at our faculty and university has been evidenced, and we very much look forward to hearing your reflections on what we as a university can learn from Professor Wekker's talk and where we should go forward. So without any further ado, I would like to invite now Professor Gloria Wekker.
Thank you, Professor Nadia Fadil, sorry. Good evening, everyone. Leuven community, dear colleagues, students, staff, and organizers. I'm pleased to be invited to speak to you tonight, and also honored. I will be speaking to you about the experiences of the Diversity Committee that was organized at the University of Amsterdam after the occupation of the Maagdenhuis, the administrative center of the university, in February 2015. I also need to say that I am pleased that an initiative has been taken at KU Leuven to start addressing diversity. So let me start with one of my favorite quotes by Nobel Prize winner of literature, Toni Morrison, because it is so applicable to our topic tonight too. In her essay, Home, she says, I have never lived, nor have any of us, in a world in which race did not matter. Such a world, free of racial hierarchy, is usually imagined or described as dreamscape, Edenesque, utopian. So remote are the possibilities of its achievement. Now comes the crucial sentence. How to be both free and situated. How to convert a racist house into a race-specific yet non-racist home. How to enunciate race while depriving it of its lethal cling. So I want to talk a little bit about what she's saying here and why these words are so important. So she is saying no one of us has ever known a world in which race did not matter. All of us are suffused with it. We are produced by race. Race is a greatly under-acknowledged part of our common sense and academic knowledge production. This is my taking on this quote. So she asks, how can we be both free and situated? How can we convert a racist house into a race-specific yet non-racist home? So she is urging us not to be colorblind, but to be race cognizant. Also, of course, not to be racist. We should be race-specific, yet non-racist, is what she's saying. And now I'm talking as me again, I understand race as a silent but powerful organizer of ourselves, our institutions, including knowledge production, and of society as a whole. An important part of my work, really, for the past 40 to, let's say 45 years, has been to investigate the ways in which we got to this place as Western European societies, where race is the pink elephant in the room. So race has been studied, for instance, in the Netherlands, but more in the sense of what is happening to people of color My book was the first one to address race as whiteness. What does it mean to be white? What kind of characteristics can we discern about whiteness? How is whiteness performed? What does it mean to be white? So this is the first time that has been put on the table. We have been studying the other, but we haven't studied the dominant white self. So we don't like this topic as a general attitude. I do not um, hesitate to say that. That has been my experience. This is a topic that we do not like. Yet, if we want to be the society that we imagine ourselves to be, if we want to be the society that Toni Morrison is asking for, we need to study whiteness because so much power is invested in it, while we simultaneously tend to deny that power. So we have been treading carefully around race, not addressing it. We dance around the pink elephant. We avoid to come to terms with it and to name race as a fundamental grammar of difference, just as fundamental as gender and class and sexuality, which is the case in Dutch society, and I also assume in Belgian society. Okay, so now I'm going to talk about the spring of 2015, when there was a lot of discontent among workers and students at the University of Amsterdam. It had risen to great heights. There was widespread discontent about how the university, so many people felt, was spending too much money on prestigious and expensive housing projects instead of on teaching and research. There were ever rising numbers of students, classes that were overflowing, professors trying to buy themselves out of education, while younger faculty and PhD students were teaching ever more classes. This really broke my heart when I was doing the research to talk to PhD students who were trying to finish their PhD, but also had to teach, and how overburdened they were, and psychic problems. That was really one of the problems that came to the fore. Also, another domain of discontent was the lack of transparency about how all kinds of commands came down from the top of the bureaucratic pyramid to the people teaching and to support staff about new rules and regulations. It was never clear whether there was any participation possible in these decisions. So there was continuous overwork, and all of these factors were putting pressure on teachers, staff, and students. Nadia has already mentioned the international context of South Africa. In England, a lot was going on at university. During the occupation of the Maagdenhuis, the theme of diversity at the UvA firmly crystallized. For some members of the academic community, this came as a surprise. Others were ready to grab the moment and the momentum with regard to diversity that they had been waiting for so long. So they organized groups of students of color, organized lectures and discussions in the Maagdenhuis during the occupation. They invited speakers, and I was one of them. And we all illuminated different aspects, problems, and ideals of diversity. I had been a student at the UvA myself at that point 45 years ago, And it pained me to see how little had changed in terms of composition of staff and students and in terms of curriculum. Just last week, Wednesday, I held a lecture at the University of Luik, where I'm currently holding the King Willem-Alexander Chair of Lowland Studies. So that lecture in which I talk about how to survive the university as a space invader can still be seen. It's online. So all these different actions and activities taking place during the occupation made it clear that UvA was not experienced by everyone as an inclusive university that takes differences between people and ideas seriously on board. One started hearing mottos like, why is my university so white? Why are all my teachers white? Why is my curriculum so white? And, you know, why are all my teachers white? In my Luik lecture, I also mentioned this specific point, what it has meant to me to go to the United States to do my PhD when I was 37 years old after a career as a public servant, when I had a Black female professor for the first time. It is hard to overestimate the value of seeing someone in front of you who embodies your ideals, who is a professor. You want to be like her. You've never had the experience of seeing someone like that who looks like you. This is one of the privileges of whiteness. I don't want to take it away from you. I want you to be aware of it, that it is not the same for everyone. I had to go to the States to experience that. And I doubt that it is a common experience for many students of color, either in the Netherlands or in Belgium, to have a professor who looks like you. One of the banners on the Maagdenhuis read, "No democratization without decolonization." This firmly connected democratization and decoloniality. So decoloniality is the set of ideas that departs from the inside that modernity and coloniality go hand in hand. They came into being simultaneously. Modernity became possible by going on colonial projects, on imperial projects. They presuppose each other. And coloniality has filled our cultural archive, which is a concept that I borrow from Edward Said. It's what we think, but also what we feel, our affect, in which a hierarchy between different races is established. That cultural archive was necessary to embark on that imperial project, but we have never deconstructed it. It has remained in place. And so one of the things we need to do, and in which the university should play a much more prominent part, is to deconstruct that cultural archive, that storehouse of thought, affect, and structures of feeling. Structures of feeling in the sense that Raymond Williams uses it. After the occupation was ended by the Central Board, after 6 weeks, it was ended in April 2015, 2 committees were formed. First was finance and housing. The second one was democratization and decentralization. And through the pressure of a new conglomerate of old and new groups around diversity and decolonization, a third committee was established because these groups, among which were student groups of color like Amsterdam United, University of Color, New Urban Collective, they were joined by the Central Workers Union, the Central Student Council, the New University Humanities Rally, the unions, and Rethink. So a whole bunch of new organizations were coming like mushrooms out of the ground. And all these organizations found each other in the demand for a third committee, the Diversity Committee. And the Diversity Committee was a subcommittee of democratization and the Decentralization Committee, the second one I mentioned. And so I was to function as the bridge between D&D and the Diversity Committee. So I became a member of D&D2, Democratization and Decentralization, and I was the chair of Diversity. So the commission, the Diversity Commission, was installed in February 2016, and its aim was to advise about diversity at UvA and how to promote diversity. There were 5 members, which were all, that was such a nice process. We were all appointed by the students of University of Color and Amsterdam United and New Urban Collective. It was, they really turned the tables on us. We had to come humbly if we could please be members of the Diversity Committee. So they were really strict with us. So eventually there were 5 members of the committee, of which there were 3 women, 2 women of color, 1 white, and 2 men, 1 man of color, 1 white man. All of us were external to UvA, or only 1 member had a temporary contract at UvA at that moment. Okay, there's a lot to be reported on, but I will limit myself to the themes that I outlined. So I want to talk about the research process and methods that we used. Secondly, about our points of departure. What are the most important findings and what were the obstacles we were up against? Fourth, the follow-up of the report. And 5 will be, which lessons can we draw from all of this? So as I was looking today on the website of the UvA and trying to locate the report, Let's Do Diversity, which is the result of our work. It used to be on the UvA website, but I was surprised to find that it has been replaced by a new product, the Diversity Policy Framework. It has been replaced since 2020. I can assure you that I'm going to look into that, where our report, Let's Do Diversity, has vanished to, because I find that rather peculiar. Okay, so I'm going to talk about the research process and methods first. So we were 5 people. One of us was a quantitative sociologist. She had to make a quantitative analysis with as the central research question, to what extent can we speak of a diverse institution when it comes to the composition of staff and students at UvA? So what are the numbers we are looking at when it comes to staff, both academic and support staff, and as far as students are concerned. We compared the diversity that is present at the University of Amsterdam, and that is 13% of the students have a non-Western background. How does that compare nationally? Nationally, over all universities, it is 12%, but 13% is rather limited when we compare, for instance, with an institution like the Free University, also in Amsterdam, which has a number of 21% students of color, and the Erasmus University in Rotterdam has 22% students of color. So especially when you think about Amsterdam being such a mixed city, a majority minority city, really, no one group is in the majority anymore, you can hardly believe that there are only 13% students of color. And really, when we are counting staff, then we find a lot of people in support staff, photocopying, working in the cafeteria, cleaning. But in the academic staff, we find mostly white folks, among which there are many international faculty, hardly any faculty of color, but I'll return to that point of faculty of color. So in the committee, we were interested in data about gender, racial, ethnic background, and also in other characteristics like socioeconomic background, functional limitations as well of the body as of the mind, religion, the region where someone had grown up. So this research was done by Dr. Marieke Slootman, who was the coordinator of this team, and together with her student assistants, she studied existing reports and databases, did a survey, and she also did a questionnaire. One of the difficulties is that these data on race, ethnicity are not freely available. Different databases need to be connected in order to discover what is happening with race and ethnicity. So gender is freely available and easy to come by, but race, ethnicity, we needed special permission to come by those data. We needed to connect different databases. And I want you to be aware that in the current COVID crisis, we are dealing with the same difficulty. Yeah? We get data on a standard basis on age and gender, not so on race, ethnicity, or on class. Whereas we have reason to suppose that when we look at the UK and the US, that the virus is not colorblind at all. Anyway, so these were some of the obstacles we ran up against. Then there were all in all, 3 research themes that are qualitative. So we wanted to know things about the UvA as an inclusive institution and community, with the aim to give insight into and do recommendation with regard to diversity. In essence, this is research that investigates the experiences of students and staff with inclusivity, whether they feel a part of the UvA community. It is about processes of inclusion and exclusion. And we were looking at formal and informal aspects. So there were two qualitative projects here, and both were targeting both students and staff of color and also white counterparts. So the first project was about the formal aspects, the absence, for instance, of a specific diversity policy, both at UvA and at the national level. What does that do to students? What recourse do students have if there is no legal framework? Another formal obstacle that I already mentioned is the difficulties associated with getting data on racial ethnic backgrounds of staff and students. So why is it that we find having access to data on gender and sexual diversity and age more important than data on racial ethnic diversity? I see it as connected to white innocence. So in this project, the researcher, Dr. Rosalba Icaza, looked at informal obstacles, also like institutionalized tradition, institutional whiteness, ways of working, language and dress codes, expectations about behavior, etc. So she and her team studied relevant legal documents and did lots of interviews with staff and students. The second qualitative research theme was also concerned with informal obstacles and looked at the ways that people talk about UvA, how they perceive their own place in it. In other words, what kind of narratives do they tell about UvA to themselves and to each other? But also, what are the images and representations about UvA? I can tell you from my own experience that once I became a professor at Utrecht University, every public relations person wanted to have me in the picture to advertise how diverse Utrecht was. I refused that because I had a hard time finding any kind of diversity at the University of Utrecht. And the same is happening with UvA, that they put students of color in the picture while you have a hard time finding them. I find that is not a way to go about it. Okay, so this second research project looked at the often implicit and unconscious power differences within the narratives and images. And the researcher here was Professor Hans Janssen. He did also interviews with staff and students, investigated text and images on the UvA website, in the curricula, took photographs of buildings, their accessibility. He looked at gathering places and people in order to ascertain how feelings of belonging or alienation came to the fore in people's narratives. The fourth project, which was also qualitative and was done by Dr. Rolando Vasquez and his student assistants, was looking at the UvA as offering and how it offered and produced broad inclusive knowledge. And it was concerned with giving recommendations as to the state of affairs with regard to knowledge practices at UvA. Central questions were, what is being taught and researched? In which ways is it done? Which forms of education are offered and how is knowledge produced? To what extent does this do justice to the diversity among staff and students and to the diversity in schools of thought? The methods Rolando used were interviews, focus groups, diversity discussion circles where teachers already practicing diversity were brought together to exchange best practices and give each other advice, and analysis of selected curricula. He devised a tool to look at curricula and to grade them in terms of diversity. So we used a wide variety of methods and questions. Our most concentrated task on the basis of these four research projects that I mentioned was to advise about the installation of a permanent diversity unit at the university, whose task would be to follow and advise with regard to policy on diversity and its praxis. So we were assigned a huge attic in the center of Amsterdam, which was our working and meeting space. It was next to the Maagdenhuis, so we were very close to where it was happening. We had a secretariat. We were really seriously facilitated by the UvA. I cannot say otherwise. We hired 13 research assistants who were assigned to each of the researchers, and I also had a research assistant. And we also had volunteers come in who offered their services for free, who were so enthusiastic about what we were doing that they wanted to contribute, if only it was photocopying or doing whatever, keeping our space clean. It was so heartwarming, the kind of support we got from the UvA community, but also from outside the community. We worked under a lot of pressure of various kinds of time, money, also public scrutiny of the public. And even in UvA, there was a lot of opposition, but we also had, as I mentioned, staunch supporters. So to this day, students and faculty are still pointing to the report, Let's Do Diversity, which in Dutch is called Diversiteit is een werkwoord, pointing to the consciousness that one needs to do hard work, not just talk about diversity, as if that is going to bring diversity about. I really want, for brevity's sake, just to point you to Sarah Ahmed's work about diversity as non-performative. Her book is called On Being Included, Racism and Diversity in Institutional Life. Okay, so now I'm going to talk our points of departure. The aim of our work was to bring about more social justice at the university, a university that strives towards equal chances for all people, a university where everyone can feel at home, which requires an active attitude. Our second point of departure was decoloniality, which, as I mentioned, is the wedding of modernity to coloniality. It means, we took it to mean, in two senses, we wanted to see diversity. Diversity of people who are present in all segments of the organization, so that we do not repeat the racial ethnic segmentation of people of color who are predominantly in support services. We want to see everybody in all segments of the organization. Secondly, we understand diversity as diversity of ideas. So diversity of people and diversity of ideas, approaches, schools of thought that are not solely focused on Western thought. This means widening the existing canon and to enrich the canon with non-Western academic perspectives and pedagogical approaches. We want a university that is conscious of the historical processes within which knowledge has been and is produced, and a university that is conscious of its impact on the social and natural environment. We should be conscious, all of us, that we are positioned as far as gender, race, ethnicity, class, sexuality, and a whole bunch of other grammars of difference is concerned. We are positioned and our knowledge is also positioned. So during our research, we came across a room in the building of the humanities, the VOC room. That is the room of the United East India Company, where they used to have meetings. I was seriously affected by seeing that room. It was the first time I saw it. I could imagine that this was the room in which the United East India Company took decisions about people who looked like me, even though they were in charge of the East Indies of Indonesia. It came very close to home to me that these are the kinds of rooms where decisions about my forebears were made. I would like to see some kind of acknowledgement of that room, what it means, why we continue to look at it, what lessons we want to draw from it. Okay. My next point of departure is intersectionality. That is what we practiced. It is a way of thinking in which not just one grammar of difference is addressed at one time, like gender. We also need to think simultaneously and ask all the time, if something is ostensibly about gender, what is happening with race? What is happening with class, with sexuality, with religion? By way of example, in 2016, so the same year our report came out, there was a period of heightened academic attention for diversity. The Minister of Education, Dr. Jet Bussemaker, announced the appointment of 100 extra female professors in the Dutch Academy. So who wouldn't be glad with that? This was to celebrate the first woman in the Netherlands going to the university. Well, I wasn't too glad, because if you do not specify that you want certain diversity among these 100 women, you're going to get 100 white women, which is exactly what happened. And it is not that I didn't point this out to all kinds of people who were involved in this process. It just seems to be too easy for people to think, well, let's take gender. It is manageable. It is to be circumscribed, what you have to deal with. It is clear, you have immediate results. It is not intersectional. It is not acceptable to do that. My next point is diversity is a precondition for academic excellence. Diversity is a precondition for academic excellence. This is the creed of many US Ivy League universities, to which we would do well to pay attention, because it has been shown over and over by now in different fields that diverse teams make for superior results. This has been shown in business environments, but these diverse teams have more inclusive thought and approaches. They think of more possibilities. Why would that not be the case in the academy? On the contrary, we often see that diversity, and especially in its incarnation of race, ethnicity, is interpreted, is seen, is conceived as taking away from excellence. Then we are going to lower the standards. That is the general feeling that is circulating, and that is sometimes spoken openly. This is not the case with gender. We have reached a position where almost everyone thinks we should have more women. And then they think white women. But with regard to race, ethnicity, it is conceived as being in opposition to quality. Okay. So my next point of departure that I want to mention is that the report and its recommendations were not just meant for faculty and students of color, but for the entire academic community. White students too will have to function in a society in which particular skills of diversity, intersectionality, and decoloniality will be an asset. What is the role of the university if it doesn't impart those skills to our future leaders who will have to deal with ever increasing diverse audiences, publics, whether they are doctors, politicians, or literary writers? A next point of departure was we wanted utter transparency. So we had regular meetings with the UvA community to report on our progress and to ask for their feedback. We clustered faculties. We have there are 9 faculties at the UvA, so we clustered 3 together and had regular meetings at those faculties. We also just sat down in the cafeteria of the biggest building on Ruterstraat and had open office hours where everybody could come and talk to us. And that happened quite a lot, and it was very nice. So finally, I want to say, with regard to these points of departure, we knew that writing this report and doing this research was our one chance to speak truth to power and not to mince words or sweeten the pill. So we did get a lot of advice about toning it down a bit, to not alienate people by words like decoloniality, whiteness, or, the goddess forbid, racism. But we did not heed that advice. We felt that we were writing for a time in the future, that we were walking in front of the music, as it were, and that it was more important to make a fundamental analysis of power differences than a report that would be easy to stomach, easy to swallow, and would just make light cosmetic changes that would not hurt anyone, but that also would do few people any good, which is precisely what is the case with the new diversity policy paper at UvA now. So I miscalculated, Nadia. I still am going to need maybe 5 to 10 minutes. Is that okay? Okay. Okay, so I'm going to refer you to the entire report. I hope it will be replaced. For the many, about 90 recommendations that we made in the report. I will offer you 5 big headings under which we offered our recommendations. So first, we need a firm anchoring of social justice and diversity. So what we are saying is we want the highest levels of the organization to be vocal about the necessity of diversity. And we need the whole community to participate in it. We also wanted a diversity unit to monitor the process. Our second big heading was make the university open to the diversity in society. This is what I talked about earlier. How can the UvA look like it does in the middle of this multi-ethnic, multiracial city? So some of the recommendations was make diversity a factor within application procedures for new employees. What we also want to do, make an active effort to go to secondary schools in the city where we have huge numbers of students of color and invite them to come and spend a day at UvA to see if it is something for them. Lots and lots more of recommendations, but just to give you an idea. The third big heading is we need to be on our way to a socially just university. And how will we bring that about? We have to take discrimination and racism and sexism seriously. And all kinds of events in which exclusion is the case, we have to explicitly address. We also need to work firmly at making our consciousness about the impact of sexist and racist jokes and expressions or attitudes bigger by establishing a visible and explicit code of conduct. So all kinds of further recommendations. Also, at UvA, at that time still, the N-word was all around, all kinds of microaggressions that we encountered. We need to move from supposedly egalitarian institution to a diversity capable university. From supposedly egalitarian, this is the dominant thought, this is an egalitarian institution. As long as you have the right characteristics, you can come in and thrive and be whoever you want to be. We have to become diversity capable, diversity conscious. This starts with designing a respectful language to talk about race, ethnicity. We need to be aware of these unconscious associations that are put in motion within our cultural archive, in which to support diversity in terms of race and ethnicity is seen as lowering the quality. The fifth heading under which we presented our report was we need to move from closed knowledge to open knowledge. We need to acknowledge that there are more sources of knowledge that are available to us than are currently being offered in the university. We need to make sure that diversity is institutionally anchored and visible in practices. And it should count, for instance, in these exams that teachers do in order to get their papers to be able to teach. Onderwijsbevoegdheid, it is called in Dutch, their educational capabilities. We should connect these things in a smart way so that we spread diversity thought. Okay, I'm definitely going to work towards the end. So what was the follow-up of the report? This is not a pretty story of all is well that ends well. The diversity unit was eventually formed. It consists of 10 people. Notwithstanding our very strong recommendations to the central board of the university, these are 10 white people, men and women. This doesn't send a good message. So apart from content, it doesn't send a good message. That is the main recommendation that was followed. A lot were just left by the wayside. For instance, an independent ombudsman who could deal with complaints about racism, sexism, homophobia, and there have been legion instances of #MeToo events at UvA. Which lessons can we draw from all of this? To think decolonially requires that we become aware of how 400 years of imperialism in the Netherlands, shorter here in Belgium, has filled our cultural archive with ideas and affect that is suffused with the superiority of whiteness. We as teachers could, for instance, start with studying how imperialism has shaped the beginnings of our disciplines and teach our students about that so that it becomes a standard part of our curricula. To think intersectionality, as I have explained, is absolutely vital. It is too easy to just deal with gender and think you're on your way. You're on your way to further cementing whiteness. If you consider gender in isolation from race, ethnicity, class, and the other factors. We need people who are high up in the organization, who are vocally supporting and visibly acting in favor of intersectional diversity. We should also make actions in the framework of diversity a criterion to judge employees' performance by. We, of course, also need grassroots initiatives, working and demanding change. It has often struck me how much the UvA resembles the wider, predominantly white society, the Netherlands, that it is a part of. A very positive self-representation that tells us that anybody can enter and feel at home who has the required characteristics. Like we used to tell ourselves, we still tell ourselves that even though we had an empire, somehow in a miraculous way, racism has bypassed us. We do not do race, others do, Americans and South Africans, but we don't. This self-flattering image of ourselves puts the burden of adjusting on the other. He or she needs to change, not we. This is operating from a deficit perspective for the other, while it's important to become aware of how whiteness reigns in our institutions. Finally, let us not delude ourselves that the presence of international students, especially if they are EU, specifically white, makes up for the absence of Belgian students of color. It is comfortable and flattering to think that international students take care of diversity in the institution, but the true test of how diverse we are is in how much access Belgian students of color have, how much they feel at home, and how successful they are. Thank you for your attention.
Thank you so much, Professor Wekker, for this very rich talk, which led us into the details, you could say, of the different phases and aspects of the research you conducted, where it started, the prologue, you could say, the different steps you took in doing the research, the main, you could say, also barriers you were confronted with, and also the kind of pitfalls you identify, and also identifying possible pathways forward. And I would also like to highlight and underline the way you speak is also very, maybe one of the signatures of how you write and work as an academic, right? Very much, you could say, informed and very solid theoretically and empirically, but at the same time also with an implication of yourself, this autoethnographic component that also always comes into the story. And I think that's always one of the fascinating things I've always found about your style, and one of the inspiring things that you do as an anthropologist and as a scholar. But I would like now to give the floor to Professor Egermont, Dean of the Faculty of Social Science, who will respond with some thoughts.
Thank you very much. Also on my behalf, thank you very much, Professor Wekker. I feel particularly honored to share some reflections after your, I must say, extremely fascinating lecture. I also feel humble in this context, I should add, because who am I to say something about this topic? My own field is far from decolonization as a topic of expertise. I've read about it, of course, but I've never written anything about decoloniality. So I hope you don't mind that I'm going to share some personal reflections tonight. One of the reasons, I guess, why I was asked to say something tonight is that I take on a leadership role at the university, and Nadia also referred to it before your lecture. I try to be a dean from a people's perspective. I constantly seek the empathy I think I need to work with people. I try to understand people. I'm also full of intentions that I think are the right intentions, and I'm aware that such intentions can sometimes help, but often also may work in the opposite direction, and can even be vindictive for people with a certain background or a certain history. That's how I describe myself as a dean of a faculty at KU Leuven. But what worries me is this: I generally feel the way I just described myself. And at the same time, I'm fully aware that just about any university administrator at about any university would describe him or herself in this way. It's a description you cannot be opposed to. This means that university administrators who are as good as they see themselves or want to see themselves, that this may not be enough, that this does not bring the change that is needed, because our universities are what they are. And by that, I mean not without issues. And that's what you've discussed also tonight. That's the first reflection I wanted to share tonight. Empathy and good intentions may not be enough, are not enough. They may even slow down the change that is needed, I sometimes think. And another question related to that is, could it be that decoloniality as a project has a greater chance of being successful if we approach it as a confrontation? Every part of me says no. Every part of me says we need coalition. But to me, decolonization, and I think the same is true for you, is not just a metaphor. It really has to challenge structures. It needs to be unsettling. It needs to be radical. Essentially, it is radical. So while on the one hand, every part of me says we need appeasement and coalition, at the same time, I think I do not want to deny the ownership of decoloniality, because I know it's personal. I know it's about real stories. It's about students who do not recognize themselves in our universities and the knowledge they produce. It's about the student of color who hears her fellow students dream of careers and about her own fear not even to be invited for job interviews, for instance. So decoloniality is much more than what I'm going to say now, but it's also a movement that offers a sense of belonging to those who do not feel in the right place at our universities. And that's really something that strikes me, that is like a shock to me, that this is what really is going on with people in our academic community. And to change this is what I would like to be a top priority of every university, but not, and that's one of my struggles, not in a way that takes away the ownership from those who are entitled to that ownership. So a second concept that is central to my reflections is the concept of ownership. Who owns decoloniality? We should all own it, but maybe we're not all entitled to own it. These reflections bring me in a position of course, self-evidently being strongly supportive, of course, it goes without saying, but at the same time hesitant, because I feel a sort of guilt. I do not want to own a struggle in a way that may weaken this struggle. I definitely do not want it to be a performance, and you've referred to that also tonight. I definitely do not want it to be a performance of white administrators. Definitely not, because that doesn't help the cause that is so important. And I think there was a similar issue when it comes to not just university administrators or people in leading positions at universities, but also the wider academic community. If we understand decoloniality as a social movement, and I think it's more than that, but at least it is where different movements come together, then it is an important question: who are we going to involve in this movement? How can the movement grow? How can it win followers? How do we convince people? And I think, as far as I could see, at least, that I think that this is a question that got little attention so far. But we as a university need to think about the involvement of a wider community of advocates of decoloniality. Because if decolonization is a matter of transforming knowledge, of transforming institutions, and that is what it is, then it requires a diffusion of new ideas. Then it requires some sort of audacity to deconstruct existing knowledge, as a concept you also referred to tonight. And if there is anything that is important to scientists, of course, I should say, is that it's that we have to deconstruct knowledge and replace it with new and wider knowledge, and labeled by concepts such as positionality, of course, but that takes courage. And courage requires conviction and persuasion and role models and exemplary behavior. So basically, how are we going to convince a wider group inside and outside the university? That's one of the important questions for me. Maybe my background as a communication scholar is also influencing the notion that I think that's an important question. Related to that is the question: are we going to leave it to the current dynamic within the universities, which I understand as a constant back and forth between seeking coalition on the one hand and holding on to a militant, some sort of oppositional position on the other hand? Or are we to find another dynamic? I think that's a crucial concept or question too for each and every university, because to me, decolonization is an epistemic struggle in order for social struggles to follow. So the movement can only be successful, to only signify a new start, when the knowledge, the perspectives, and the discourses have changed. So the universities, to me, are the prime context of research, knowledge, and education, and therefore at the heart of decolonization. That's what you also shared with us tonight. So if the university talks about responsibility, social responsibility, and we do like to talk about it, then it's not about hesitant following. It's about the clear notion that universities must lead. But that makes my question even more pertinent, of course, because how are we going to get people on board? There's quite a lot of people tonight attending this meeting, but not if you compare it to the number of people studying and working at university. So I think it's a matter of policy decisions, but it's much more than that. It's also a matter of broad support throughout universities. And one of the final questions that brings to mind, at least to my mind, and one of the struggles I feel is, where does this responsibility lie? Should those who find themselves in a disadvantaged position today also be the ones responsible for convincing others? Can we expect that? What we certainly cannot do, I think, is just leave it to them. It's not them, by the way, it's us. But it remains a delicate question of responsibility, which to me may need to be more central to the approach we need. So basically, Professor Wekker, the reflections I wanted to share tonight revolve, for me at least, around the concepts of good intentions, ownership, responsibility. Three concepts that share my personal reflections, and I think it's more personal struggles. Three concepts also, Professor Wekker, and now I'm trying to finish with a question of which I wonder whether you think they are familiar to the part of decolonization in universities. Is it, in your experience, something you've seen at other universities as well? A question of who owns this movement, who's responsible for it? What about intentions and actual changes, and how they, well, to a certain extent, there may be some tension between intentions and actual changes. Thank you.
Thank you, Professor Eggermont. Professor Wekker, do you want to respond to some of these questions?
Please, thank you, Professor Eggermont, for your thoughtful ideas and questions. I do encounter some of these questions, and these are not easy questions, of course. Rather than staying in, I would like to look at the concept of coalition and ownership in this context, and who is responsible. So I'd like to, rather than remain in an oppositional stance, I would like to think about ways of being an ally. I think that would be a viable stance, and given the wideness of the institution, we, as people who are not in that majority, need firm allies. So I would like people to think more about allyship than about how can we get these people to remain silent. How can we pretend that all is well, because it isn't well? We see, as a matter of fact, one of the things I see is that faculty of color and students of color have an incredibly hard time. I see it at UvA, where the few Black professors that were there have, as in a revolving door, left the UvA. And it wasn't as if there were many, yeah? They could be counted on the fingers of one hand. Their life was miserable, and they kind of used me as their ear to speak about their experiences. Way after the committee was finished, there is no ombudsman, still not an independent ombudsman at the UvA. I also know of the pain of so many students of color, of being set apart, of having to speak, on behalf of your whole group, not being an individual. So there's a lot of work to be done. And you can imagine how I myself, who also have prematurely left the university because I found it untenable, how I kind of get tired of speaking about this. So I certainly do not want to be the one carrying responsibility for this topic. I feel if it's anything, it's part of our joint history, it's part of our joint responsibility, and it means that one has to educate oneself, just as that is happening in the rest of society, where white people are educating themselves on what it means to be white. So people in the university need to educate themselves about what that means, what kind of privileges come with it, what kind of curricula do I bring across to a wide variety of students? How do I privilege certain students in that and disadvantage others? So I want to talk about allyship, about joint ownership and our joint history and reality. And that also carries with it that we are jointly responsible for changing this.
Thank you. Thank you, Professor Wekker, for these answers. I think there are actually quite a few questions that are being asked and addressed that go in the same direction in the chat. And I think this question of responsibility, ownership, and coalition formation is indeed one that is quite crucial and often comes back in the discussion. So I suggest that we maybe move to the questions that are being asked by the audience and see and address some of these. So I've written some while you were talking, and I think one of the first question that has been asked is how we can, if we are to change institutions from within, how do you start the deconstruction process? So that's one of the questions that is being asked. How do you start the process of deconstructing in local communities that are not aware of this fact whilst the remains of the colonial system are in place? How do you manage and control the narrative? So that's one of the questions. And maybe linked to that, maybe that could also be interesting to address. It is another person asks, why should we engage in the university to start with? And it is a question that is being asked in several variations in the Q&A. Is the university a place of investment? Some people say, so in one question it is formulated as, why do people of color want to change white institutions from within? Why do we want to do that effort? Are we not remaining trapped in the same kind of logic that recenters the West instead of creating alternative sites? So in other variations, it's also being asked in other questions about, should people not rather invest in creating alternative and autonomous institutions? So maybe we could start there and then see, and then move on to the next questions.
Yes, okay. But I would also like to hear other people's ideas about this question. So if Nadia and Stephen or Hilde would like to respond, that would also be
yes, that's
very welcome to me.
Yeah, and I think this question is also one going back to Stephen. I see there are also a few questions for Professor Egermont, so I think we might want to come back, and I think it would also be interesting indeed to ask to the Vice Rector, maybe she has some remarks or some impressions, or what these first, you could say, moments of input to a certain extent trigger. But maybe we could start with these questions, and then I can go back to Professor Egermont and to Professor Weiss.
Oh, do you want me to start?
Yeah.
Oh, okay, all right. Okay, so starting with the second set of questions, why should we want to invest in the university? Is this a place we are trapped in? Well, I happen to think that the university should be useful to all of us. I love the university as a concept. The experiences were not so easy. So one of the things one might consider is it doesn't do to recruit other people who are not part of the dominant groups piecemeal, one by one, but to invite little clusters of other people in order that they can empower each other, give support to each other. I said that also in my Luik lecture, that what had made me survive was an international network of female and queer professors of color, which made me aware that I was not crazy. So that is really incredibly important. I see that in the last couple of years, I see all kinds of extra university initiatives, Black universities, Black summer schools. There is a decolonial summer school that is organized by my friend and colleague and committee member Rolando Vasquez every summer. I think it would not be bad at all to follow such courses, to see what is happening there, and to bring it back with you into the university where you're working. I do not know how feasible it is to think that we should be able to erect a university of our own, and whether we should want that. Where are we gonna find the money? Where are we gonna find the teachers? I don't think it's very practical. I would, of course, like, and I've done that while I was a professor, and still to this day, I am involved in all kinds of constituencies of color who I like to exchange knowledge with. But that is a kind of investment that I find important, but I also am not willing, as a matter of principle, to kind of say, well, that's the university, that's for white people, we don't have anything to look for there. I don't agree with that. I think that we should be striving towards transforming the university and make it a more hospitable place for everyone. How do you start? Well, this process of deconstruction, I mentioned several things in my lecture. I think it needs study. It needs studying and developing an outlook on the world, a worldview that takes history seriously and that is aware that we are produced by our histories, by our positionings, and we should collect knowledge about that. And so it helps to read. There is this whole school of decolonialism, decoloniality in the Netherlands, which originally comes from Latin America, but who have several teachers who have found firm ground at universities in the Netherlands. So it's not impossible to gather this knowledge. It takes work. It takes work to develop that outlook on the world, to be aware of power differences. And also it takes work to develop this stance of being an ally, wanting to be in coalition with people of color. So I'll leave it there.
Thank you so much, Gloria. Maybe I now want to ask a question to Professor Egermont and also Professor Vijs. One of the things that you said in your talk, Professor Wekker, was about this necessity to make diversity a criterion to assess one's work. And I think that's a really interesting one, because we generally look at teaching excellence, at how much money we get into the university, about the service that we do in commissions, but diversity is rarely indeed a criterion. Maybe you could come back and maybe explain a bit more later what you mean by that. But I would like to ask, yes, Professor Egermont, maybe we can start with you. What would it mean to make it more enforceable? Because I think in your questions, you very much somehow talked about the kind of position in which many academics find themselves, having a good intention, but at the same time, you could say being part of the structure that reproduces exclusion. What would it mean to take it away, you could say, institutionally from the individual intention and to ingrain it in the operation of the structural logic of the university, which would go back to what Professor Wekker was saying, making diversity a criterion to assess one's work. Would that be possible? How would you go about it? What kind of, in other words, what are the enforceable measures that university has in order to be able to make work of that? I'm thinking, for instance, the KU Leuven at some point decided that of all the new hires at the tenure track, half should be women, right? So at some point it started working with positive action measures. Are these tracks that are invisible? Are there other ways one could think of possibilities to you could say make a certain push in restructuring the organization of the university?
Thank you, Nadia. It's an important question, but a difficult one, of course. One of the things I take away from what Professor Wekker just said is it needs work. It needs work. You have to work on it. It's a way. It's a matter of studying and changing your perspective and acknowledging your positionality, and all these things we can or could, and I think we should ask from people. I think we can, if we ask people, for instance, when it comes to teaching, if we ask professors to show that you're a good teacher and that you're in a deliberate way thinking of how to teach and the didactic principles you will be using in your teaching. If we can ask that, we can also ask to the same professors, how do you make sure in your courses, in the materials you teach, that there is a variety of topics and a variety of perspectives there? And have you questioned your own position when it comes to teaching, when it comes to your own, when it comes to how you relate as a professor to your students, to the literature you're using in courses? So we often ask professors and people working at university locally to reflect on themselves. To reflect on themselves is step one. It's not enough, but it's step one of a process of decoloniality. So I think we can embrace questions of diversity, of decoloniality, of positionality in those moments in certain careers of, for instance, professors, where we ask them to reflect on themselves. So I think that's something we can ask, and I think we should. And I think we shouldn't be afraid of asking that kind of questions, because, well, it will not be a popular measure, of course not. But if it asks people to reflect, and if you are not willing to reflect when you're working on a university, maybe you're not in a position you should be at the university. So I'm not afraid of taking, or I wouldn't be afraid of taking some stronger measures there, and really ask people to show how they have done this work, because that's what it is, as Professor Wekker just told. It needs work. Another element that I'm definitely taking away from tonight, and not just from tonight, but also from what I've been reading on this topic before, and for instance from Professor Wekker's work, is allyship. Show that you are an ally of the people in the academic community. And there are different ways of showing that. Where one of the things we ask from professors at our university is, how do you relate to society? How do you improve society with the knowledge you produce? Well, one element, at least one element of those questions could be, how do you make allies or allyships with students, and not just students, also colleagues and scholars all over the world who have other positions, other perspectives than those you have been familiarized with when you were studying. So inviting and forcing even reflection is, for me, one way of dealing with this question. Will it be something that we can quantify? No, but I do not think that necessarily is a problem. At least not in my opinion. I think we need to quantify less, also in other aspects of how we evaluate positions at university. That's the first reflection, but I have to admit that it's a difficult question.
Thank you, Professor Egermont. Professor Vijs, can we go beyond the good intention?
Yeah, of course, we should go beyond the good intention, and it's a difficult question indeed. Yes, I think, yeah, as a principle, yeah, everyone that comes to our university has the right to feel welcome at our university. We should care for the well-being, and we should, I think, yeah, by how can we make diversity and inclusion, we should, I think, try to embed it much more, not only on a central level and in a diversity policy, but we should try to connect very much into the organization. And this, I think, so with this I mean that we should have a much better connection within the faculties, and by making our the topic of inclusion and diversity visible, and that's one aspect. On the other hand, I think we could work on broadening the frames of reference. Is also another aspect I think we could work on further, so that for example, the charter that Professor Egermont is now working on, I think it's a first part by giving the importance that our university gives to the domain of diversity and inclusion. And I think we still miss that. I think that is a first step to do, to make it very embedded in our universities, to all the students, at the level of the students, the faculty, the staff, at all levels. And I think this is the first step. Then secondly, I think we, next to the broadening of reference frames, I think it's indeed important to also base ourselves on data and make that also, share that with each other. I think that's also an aspect that we need to focus on as well, and yeah, let us guide by theoretical frameworks, as I have seen in Gloria Wekker, her recommendations as well. So that's also another aspect. Yeah, these are some points, but difficult to answer.
Thank you. I mean, I think one of the challenges is indeed to think about how do we, and I think at KU Leuven, one of the challenges that KU Leuven also finds itself, I think in a talk, preparing this conversation, Gloria, I also told you that KU Leuven actually faces very similar challenges like the UvA compared to other universities located in more metropolitan contexts. It attracts less students from a working class or with a non-European background. And I think it comes back to also a bit what you were saying about the findings of your report. What stories do institutions tell about themselves, right? And I think one of the stories the KU Leuven tells about itself is that it is one of the high-ranking, top elite universities, and this also can deter, maybe act as a deterrence for certain students. And I think one of the key challenges is really how do you move into you could say taking action that is not just, you could say, at the level of the change of mentality or the change of framework, but that really looks at what are the structural hurdles that are not just in the stories that people tell about institutions, but also, for instance, the kind of tuition fees that I think in the Netherlands, for instance, the tuition fees have also increased drastically over the recent years. Belgium is also following that direction, not with the same speed, but more and more. And this brings me to another element that was asked in the questions, the neoliberalization of the universities, the fact that universities are also starting to operate more and more as markets, where also international students are becoming the attractive students because they also bring money into the university. How does that also relate with the task of the university to democratize, right? Which also sometimes implies certainly to include in, students that do not have a cash flow, right? That do not have the money to enroll themselves and that are not bringing money into the university, scholarship students, and what have you. So I think these two movements of internationalization on the one hand and neoliberalization on the other hand, that sometimes play in very contradictory ways in the way the university works, because internationalization is often also the way the university markets itself as diverse and open. So I don't know whether you have some thoughts on that. I'm now just taking the freedom, sorry for the people who are asking questions. I see there are so many questions, so I will not be able to address them all, but I'm taking a synthesis from some of the questions that are being asked in the chat.
Okay, right. So these are some very interesting questions. I addressed some of it in my talk, where I also have seen this happen, the increasing neoliberalization of the university, where money seems to be the only currency that counts. So that is true in terms of tuition. It is also true in how the university evaluates faculty who do not bring in enough money, because that means that your work is less interesting, less valuable. What are you doing, basically? Now, this is unfortunate that for the longest time, for instance, the Dutch research organization just didn't see the point of funding research that had to do with race. That is slowly changing, but you can see how that is costly, has been costly to me personally. Now, luckily, that is changing, but it puts different people in different positions. And the least the university can do is be aware of how these researchers are differentially positioned by the powers that be, in this case, neoliberalization. Connected to this also is, rather than uniformity, I would much rather be in favor of different criteria for different people, and not only on the basis of gender or race or whatever, but also on what your passion is. I don't think we should put everybody against the same measurements. I don't think one size fits all. We should be looking. So there are certain things that we should try to accomplish, asking people, so in what sense is your work tending towards greater consciousness of diversity, or how you yourself are positioned? But I also think that there are different criteria in an academic community that are valuable, even while they do not come under the traditional headings. It may be valuable what someone is producing, but it may be part of a very small school of thought. It may not garner the finances that are interesting to the university, yet this work is important and this person should be allowed to do that kind of work. So that would be one of the things that I would be in favor of. So yes, this thing about the stories that we tell ourselves as members of a particular academic community, I find them really important, both the national stories that we tell ourselves and each other about who we are as a nation, who are we as the Dutch, who are we as Belgians, but also looking at the stories we tell ourselves as universities and how excellent we are and how those narratives may in themselves exclude people. I find that really important, to be aware of what messages you send out to the world and to first generation students or first in the family migration students. But you see, this should not be taken as the example that I gave, that one does PR with people of color on the brochures and the website, yet they are not there. I strongly object to that. There should be a sizable presence of different students in all kinds of respects, different. And then also those students will make a difference in what they want from the institution, and they will feel freer to express that when there are more of them around.
Thank you, Professor Wekker. There are still so many questions I would like to ask. There are actually more than 66 questions in the chat box alone, and many of them are tending to indeed how do we go beyond the good intentions? How do we go beyond the consciousness raising or the awareness making movements? It seems like also reading through the different questions that people are somehow fed up with just being at that level, right? And want to see direction moving ahead, right? And steps being taken that go beyond just to the good intentions and let's think about it, but move towards action. One of the questions, one of the persons was even asking, should we not make students into more activists? Should that not be part of our diversity policy? And another reminds us that issues of diversity are not just an issue of welcoming or desirability, but there are issues of social justice and obligation. So it's not about being good, it's about creating equality amongst all those who pay taxes for these institutions, reminding us that the universities are publicly funded institutions, hence everybody has an ownership in those universities. So I think I'm going to take those as comments and as remarks. Because if we're going to start addressing them, I think we will still stick around for some time. But unfortunately, we have to start closing this session. Do you want to add something, Professor Wekker?
Can I please say a last final thing? I indeed mentioned Sarah Ahmed, who is also a very interesting person to read. Mind you, she also left the university, a brilliant professor in the UK, couldn't take it anymore. So this is something to take into account, what the university does to people of color. It's not a fun place. So, but her book, the book that I mentioned about On Being Included, talks all the time and centrally about how talking about diversity takes the place of action. And what is needed most fundamentally is action, setting an example. This is what we intend to do, and we are serious about it. And this is what it looks like. And what it looks like is that it is going to shake up the institution. Things as they were are going to have to need to change, both in terms of compositions of certain bodies within the university and also in terms of curricula. So this is a serious thing, and good intentions help, surely. But like, you know, all the things that need to be done to make the university a socially just place, we're far removed from that. And it is not as if nobody has written about that. So there's a lot to be learned about these processes that need to be put in motion to make a difference.
Thank you, Professor Wekker. Thank you for these wise words, and I hope, unfortunately we can't applaud, but this is a virtual applause for your wisdoms and for your contributions. I see also many people have shared in the chat their praise and are very grateful for your words. I think, yeah, the last words are really important. It's not just a matter of intention or words, it should also be a matter of action. And obviously, hopefully many people who have attended this session will also hear it. And this is something that we have to do collectively, staff, students. We're all responsible for creating this other university we want to see emerging. And this brings me also to another, the last point for tonight, the point of action in a very humble and modest way, you could say. I now give the floor to Dr. Joyce Koeman and Raft Haase, who both work for the Diversity Policy Office, and will conclude this session by introducing us to one of the new projects that we try to set up in the coming months, and that's a project called Blind Spots.
Yes, thank you, Nadia. And on behalf of the diversity policy team of KU Leuven and the Faculty of Social Sciences, I want to express my gratitude to each and every one of you who has taken the time to join us this evening. Like you said, Nadia, we had a lot of questions. It's impossible to answer them in this short period of time. So one thing that this evening has learned us is that coloniality and decolonization are not some constructs of the past, but something very real and tangible that permeates society and hence our academic community every day.
Yes, and so what we've learned is that building awareness and moving towards action is now key for us as well. Therefore, I am happy to announce that with the support of Vleer UOS, the Belgian Development Corporation, and a team of experts in humanities, as of tonight, we are officially launching the Blind Spots project. This is a project that aims to inform current debates and actions, or lack thereof, as well as research and education by sharing knowledge, expertise, and current practices, join them together, but also by amplifying a multitude of voices that often tend to be overlooked. So for this, we want to show what decolonization actually means to you, to students, researchers, and staff at KU Leuven. We want to start from the personal histories, your stories and experiences that may strengthen our call for equality and social justice. So please help us by sharing your stories on our brand new website, www.kuleuven.be, diversiteit/blindspots, and make us aware of our own blind spots. Share your story and answer some very basic questions, what decolonization actually means to you and how we should move forward in the future. So this leaves me with saying thank you for joining us tonight, and feel free to send us your thoughts at blindspots@kuleuven.be. Thank you very much.
Thank you everyone for being here and for attending. I would also like to thank again Professor Wekker for being part of accepting this invitation and for sharing your words with us. And I think we will now close this session. Thank you.